Okay, so these ones just say to factor out the common factor. Now remember, the common factor means what do these two terms have in common that we can pull out. It's like we undo the distributive property, okay? So we undo the distribution that already happened, okay? And so remember, terms are separated by addition and subtraction. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, here's two terms, okay? -5 and 25x, okay? And they have to have some factor in common, which means they can divide by the same number. So I ask myself, what does 5 and 25 have in common? Well, or 25x. Well, they have a 5 in common, right? So I could divide both of these by 5. And when I do that, -5 divided by 5 actually turns into 1. So I'm going to write it like this, though. I'm going to write the 5 outside because I divided it out, right? And so this is, again, remember when we practiced the distributive property, we took something outside parentheses and we multiplied it in, okay? We're just like undoing that. So now I'm like taking it back out. Like take that same thing out of both of them, okay? So when I divide -5 by 5, I actually just end up with -1, okay? And when I divide 25x by 5, I end up with 5x. Now remember, we got to break that down in case you're struggling with that, because remember 25x can be written as 5 times 5 times x. That's what it means, right? That's what 25x means. It's 25 times x, which is the same as 5 times 5 times x. And when we divide this by 5, we notice that this 5 up here and this 5 down here can both be divided out, and I'm left with 5x, okay? So because these are multiplying together, I can do this. Remember, if it was addition, you know, that's a problem. This is when we kill kitties, right? We cannot, no, don't do that, right? That's a bad idea. But when it's multiplication, we just break it all down. And if we have a 5 on top, 5 on bottom, they cancel each other out or divide out. Okay, so then this is it. That's as far as it goes. Nothing else can happen there. You just pull out the 5 and then you're done. Okay, now this next one, again, we're like, what do they both have in common? So we're going to like draw the parentheses. We're just like, what can we pull out of there? So we're taking something out of here. We're taking something out of here. The same thing. Well, they're both even. So I know they both divide by 2. So let me think. If I divide this by 2, it'd be 6. And this divided by 2 would be 10, which they still have something in common. So they've got to divide by a bigger number. So let's see 4, right? So I know that 12 divided by 4 is 3. Okay. So I know, and then 20 also divides by 4, and that's 5. So that's good. So let's pull that 4 out. And what am I left with? I'd be left with a -3, okay? And then 20 divided by 4 is 5. Now, do you see how I'm leaving a lot of spaces? Because I'm just kind of ignoring those A's for a minute because I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with them yet. So sometimes I work with the numbers first and then I work with the variables. You can do all at the same time if you want. But remember that this 12a we could rewrite as 12 times a, which is this, a squared, sorry, 12 times a squared. Now 12 is 4 times 3, and it was negative, so let's make one of those negative, okay. So 4 times -3 times a, right? That's what it really is, right? And then 20a, we could rewrite as 4 times 5 times a. So now when we look at this, we see like exactly what they have in common. See how they both have a 4 and they both have an a in them? So that's what we're going to take out. We took out the 4, and now let's take out the a. Okay? Now this one, when I divide out a 4, right, that kind of cancels out that 4. And when I divide out an a, it gets rid of one of those a's because we didn't really they didn't disappear. They just go outside the parentheses. So I'm taking those outside the parentheses. So what's left inside the parentheses is -3 times a. Okay? And then we're still adding this to whatever this is. Now, we divide 20 by 4, and that 4 kind of goes outside the parentheses, and we take the a outside the parentheses, so that goes away now. And so we're actually just left with 5 here. So in this case, we'd have 4a times the quantity, -3a plus 5. Okay, last one, we're going to look for the common factor. Now, again, this one has 3 terms, so we have to be able to divide it out of all 3 terms. So here's a term, and here's a term. So I can't take something out unless it comes out of every single term, okay? So I asked myself, what do they all have in common? Well, they don't actually have an n in common, right? Because this has n and this has n, but this does not. So we can't take anything out. I noticed that they're all even. 12, 6, and 2. I think that's all I can take out is a 2, right? Because like 2 doesn't have a lot of factors. So if you're struggling, again, you can list the factors. You could say like, okay, 12 is 6 times 2, which is the same as 3 times 2 times 2, right? Because 6 is 3 times 2. And then you could list out the factors of 6. 3 times 2. And the factors of 2 are just 2 and 1, right? So now I see, what do they all have in common? Well, look, they don't all have a 3 in common, but the only thing they all have in common, see how they each have a 2? That means that's our common factor, okay? So we're going to pull out a 2. So again, we're taking it outside. We're not getting rid of it. It's like not disappearing. It's just coming outside the parentheses. So we're going to like create our parentheses. And we're going to say like, okay, if I took 12n to the 4th and I divided it by 2, 12n to the 4th divided by 2. Remember, 12 is the same as 3 times 2 times 2. And n to the 4th would be 4 n's, right? And we're not going to deal with those n's because we're not dividing out any n's. But I divide by 2. Do you see how one of these 2's cancels out? And so what am I left with? I'm left with 6 n to the 4th. So when I pull this 2 outside, I have 6 n to the 4th on the inside. Now this one's a little tricky because it's a negative 6. So what is negative 6 n squared divided by 2? Well, it would also stay negative. And 6 divided by 2 is 3. So that would be negative 3n squared. Now what is 2 divided by 2? Not 0. It doesn't just disappear. Some people think that because I took a 2 out that this just disappears. But let's look here. What's left when I divide by 2? There's a 1 left, okay? So I got to write that 1. And then we're done. This one didn't ask us to factor it any further. I'm not sure. I guess I haven't really looked to see if it could factor any further. But it didn't ask us to. It just asked us to take out the common factor. So all we're having to do is take out that 2, and now we're done.